Hi gang, the war zone that is the Nachmund Gauntlet has been raging for years now, starting as a war for a single planet, Vigilus, and then spreading out into a continuation of the same war Abaddon the Despoiler has been prosecuting for 10,000 years. Now, the vast armada of Haarken Worldclaimer has reached the end of the gauntlet and strikes at the Sanctus Wall and its core world of Sangua Terra. Did you know there's a second Arbeiterian channel? Head over to Arbeiterian's Precinct House, link in the thing below. The conflict in the Nachmund Gauntlet has been raging since the opening of the Great Rift, which was at the start of 8th edition 40k. But how many years in world that is can be a little confusing. The latest book, the 10th edition Crusade Nachmund Gauntlet supplement, presents us with a timeline, but the dates in it don't actually conform to either of the dating systems established in the previous books. Looking at these dates, the only bit of the number that goes up every time is the first 3 digits, so I guess we'll assume that's the year. Whatever these numbers mean, our events are mapped out, so let's use them as a brief recap. At juncture point 879, Vigilus, recently a safe haven from the warp storms of the Great Rift, was the site of the War of the Beasts, as orcs invaded and Genestealer cults rose from the depths, saved only by the intervention of Marneus Calgar. 3 apparently years later, at juncture 882, as that war died down, the planet came under assault by Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, and his Herald of the Apocalypse, Haarken Worldclaimer, during the War of Nightmares, hastily averted by a compact between Calgar and the Eldari craft world of Samhain. At juncture 952, with the embers of that war still ongoing, the planet was reinforced by the Ministorum, and at the insistence of Inquisitor Cartavolnus, it embarked on the Coronal War, destroying cult activity across the planet with the help of the living Saint Celestine. And then at juncture 980 through 989, the Rift War happened, as Haarken Worldclaimer then led a colossal Chaos Armada down the gauntlet, relieving the Chaos Night world of Daravar and forcing besieging Space Marine forces into retreat, attacking numerous smaller worlds with 3 smaller raiding fleets before finally being caught in a delaying action by an Imperial fleet led by Admiral Priska during the Battle of the Grachiliod Narrows. Then, in the years since that, the fighting on Vigilus had grown a little again. After her purge of the Nurgle-infested Dontoria hive sprawl, the Living Saint had intervened to rescue Inquisitor Cartavolnus from an assassination attempt made by Abaddon's lieutenant on the planet, Zagramothis, at Mortvold hive sprawl at juncture 991. The Inquisitor had been investigating chaos corruption on the planet, but had become pinned down with his black iconoclast bodyguard in the depths of the hive by a demon horde summoned by Zagramothis. Celestine fought the greater demons that led the horde as Cartavolnus escaped to orbit, and while she eventually banished them in a conflagration of empiric energies, when the smoke cleared, Celestine was nowhere to be found. So, if these juncture points have years as the first 3 numbers, as I've kind of assumed, then in the current dating system this makes no sense. The first war would have happened 875 years after the Rift appeared, which is way too long for the story, and it would now be the end of the 42nd millennium, 950 years after the most recent events we've seen in any of the novels. So that's probably not correct. Another way that 40k dates have worked in the past is by giving you a 3-digit year fraction, cutting the year down into 1,000 exact parts which are about 8 hours long each. But if that's what these mean, then everything I've just said happened just in 1 year, which is way before the current timeline in the novels. So, I don't know, that's the events in order. When they happen is questionable. Maybe it's a mistake, maybe it's warp shenanigans, maybe lore tubers shouldn't be reading so much into the background of a toy soldier game. Comment what date you think it is below. Like and subscribe. Anyway, After an intermediate amount of time, Haarken Worldclaimer was finally in a position to assault Imperium Sanctus. Above the burning Jestine system at the southern point of the gauntlet, he reported as news to his master. There were no Imperial fleets left at his back, at least none of a size to trouble him, and any worlds he'd missed were under attack by Xenos marauders or pirates and raiders allied to his cause. Ranging ahead of the fleet, his vanguard of infiltrators, demagogues and saboteurs had embedded themselves in nearby Imperial worlds, causing civil strife and unrest across the region. At the northern end of the gauntlet, Vigilus was fully cut off from reinforcement, bereft of its living saint and ripe for the War Master's picking, and the only thing that barred Haarken Worldclaimer's way was the hastily constructed Sanctus Wall, a network of defensive systems in the Gorendal subsector centered on the world of Sangua Terra. Worldclaimer's task would be to, well, claim the world. Sangua Terra would be the War Master's base for an invasion of Imperium Sanctus. Defending the Imperium, spread across the Gorendal sector, were the worlds of the Sanctus Wall. Originally a series of supply hubs designed to supply reinforcements to the fighting on Vigilus, they had quickly been repurposed when news came of the progression of Harken's fleet. The systems of Jagal, Corix, Leonid and Sanguis were reinforced, initially with little more than just orders to increase their defence, and then by the stripping of worlds south of the Wall. Whole planets had been emptied of population, ancient defence lines and bastions ripped out of the soil and transferred wholesale to the systems of the Sanctus Wall in an attempt to create a viable bulwark. Systems too far into the gauntlet were abandoned, their defence forces ordered to flee ahead of the Chaos Fleet and reinforce Imperium Sanctus, and a daring gambit by Fleet Admiral Priska had bought enough time for battle groups from the Indomitus Crusades Fleet Secundus to arrive in support. Battlegroup Lambdax had already taken up station in the region. The Sanctus Wall had been reinforced as best was able, but it was still a trying situation. The fleet elements had been spread through the entire region in the hope of quick detection of any approaching Chaos Fleet, but this meant that ships were spread very thinly. The hub of the wall was the world of Sangua Terra, an urban metropolis whose population was divided between a number of Urbanosprals, the capital of which was Urbanosprawl Alpha. The reinforcements continually pouring in had been divided amongst the Urbanosprals as much as possible, but as well as forming the linchpin of the wall, Sangua Terra had its own problems to deal with. An indeterminate amount of time ago, but at the start of whatever timeline we're looking at, as the Great Rift had originally spread out, the system had been hit by a massive warp flare, the Sanguis flare, which scarred the planet, leaving mutated regions of terrain and consuming the planet's moon of Sigil, which was then turned into a twisted demon world. Since then, Sigil had been ruled over by the demon lord Chorkan, a servant of Tzeentch, and warp flare-ups, areas of twisted and unnatural landscape, minor demonic incursions, and the resulting chaos cults and civil strife had been a constant pressure on Sangua Terra's defences. However, in recent months, these piecemeal defences have been reorganised and strengthened by another luminary of the Imperium. Canoness Superior Junith Eruita of the Order of Our Martyred Lady was a veteran commander of the Adeptus Sororitas, recently arrived at the head of a War of Faith fleet dispatched by the Ministorum. A skilled and proven strategist, the Canoness had quickly installed herself in the command centre of the Primus complex of Urbanosprawl Alpha, the strategiums that were attached directly to the Cathedrum of the Pyre Deified, and from there she could oversee the defence of the entire planet. Her first move was to review the fleet defences, and with skillful political manoeuvring and the support of key naval personnel, she gave the thinly spread fleet new orders. The large capital ships were grouped together into response fleets, which were stationed far from any Mandeville points so as to avoid them becoming immediate targets, and then much smaller ships and in-system vessels were set on an overlapping network of patrol routes, scanning the void for signs of the Chaos Armada and intercepting any straggling refugee vessels. This would allow the command centre on Sangua Terra to monitor the whole sector while still keeping some power concentrated to react to wherever Haarken emerged. The first patrol to encounter the invading Chaos Armada would be the long-ranged Hydra 4 fleet. On mission near one of the system's Mandeville points, the fleet received emergency transmissions from Imperial vessels badly damaged and emerging from the warp at speed, requesting aid. Hydra 4 moved in to intercept and give help, but as they approached their comrades, the Imperial ships opened fire, and behind them, elements of the Chaos fleet started to emerge from the warp. Haarken Worldclaimer had used the captured elements of Priska's fleet as decoys to confuse any pickets he might encounter. Hydra 4 was immediately overwhelmed, unable to get away any warnings, as Harken's vast armada emerged from a dozen different Mandeville points that surrounded the Sangua system at once. In all but 2 of those, the Chaos fleet groups quickly overwhelmed any nearby patrols and disappeared into the void, but Patrol Group Boster 9, reacting swiftly to the appearance of Chaos vessels, managed to fight a valiant rearguard action as half of its patrol ships escaped the engagement zone, and it was through their actions that Sangua Terra received news of the invasion. Those reserve fleets were then deployed wherever they could do the most harm, attempting to slow down or destroy individual tendrils of the Chaos advance. One of the most successful of those actions was conducted on a heretic fleet group that had emerged from one of the furthest away Mandeville points and was lagging behind. Led by the Sons of Medusa captain Fulvian from the bridge of his battle barge, the Judgment of Magira, a powerful force of capital ships, including Eruita's own flagship, the Fraterus Templar battleship God Emperor's Mantle, fell on the Chaos stragglers, punching through the advancing fleet and destroying ship after ship, Sons of Medusa boarding teams teleporting into enemy craft as the capital ships bullied their way through the straggling fleet. They inflicted heavy casualties, forcing other tendrils to divert and respond, but eventually even they had to pull back, with a third of their response group intact, when the Chaos numbers proved just too many. Similar stories played out across the system for the next few days, as response fleets harried the Chaos tendrils, but Worldclaimer's advance couldn't be stopped. They swept through the system, long-range auger stations going silent one by one as Chaos assault forces slaughtered the defenders in claustrophobic battles. The Chaos Armada blasted its way in-system, engaging the planet's defences as the main tendrils moved into geostationary orbit above strategically significant points. The latter tendrils would slowly form a picket fleet for the Chaos invasion. Finally, Worldclaimer's own tendril moved into position, led by a ship the Imperium hadn't seen in action for hundreds of years. The Planet Killer was a vast Chaos battleship last used in the Despoiler's 12th Black Crusade, otherwise known as the Gothic War. Constructed somewhere in the Eye of Terror centuries before, and bearing no resemblance to any existing pattern of Imperial vessel, the Planet Killer was built around a multi-barreled energy weapon known as the Armageddon gun. During the Gothic War, Abaddon had used the weapon to bore through the crust of the cardinal world of Scarven, tearing apart its landmasses and eventually destroying the entire world, and for the rest of the war, the Planet Killer became a feared vanguard ship for Chaos assaults. Designed for planetary invasion, as well as its massively destructive weapon, the Planet Killer was a fleet carrier of immense size, capable of deploying swarms of dropships, atmospheric fighters and void bombers, and quite capable of defending itself against attack, studded with defense laser turrets and macro cannon batteries. The Planet Killer moved into position at the halfway point between the planet and its moon, Sigil, angling its apocalypse gun directly at Sangua Terra, and Worldclaimer called to him his officers and lieutenants. The Herald had struck a deal with Chor Khan of Sigil, the demon pledging its minions in support of the Despoiler's actions, and it gave Worldclaimer a twisted demonic mark to be granted to his champions. Balancing the obsessions of hundreds of warlords, some of whom were ill-used to serving, was complex and required a hand that was manipulative, firm, and swiftly brutal. While Worldclaimer had kept the majority of his fleet under his control, there were always war leaders and commanders commanders who chafed at the bit, berserkers or opportunists who resisted their orders and pursued their own desire for carnage or plunder. It was to these commanders Haarken granted the Demon's Mark, carved on their armour as, ostensibly, a gift to keep them yoked to his service. In fact, some of the commanders even refused to take it, seeing it as a bribe and unwilling to have their loyalty purchased so easily. But those who took the Sigil of Chorkan were assigned to the vanguard, given the most promising targets as the invasion of Sangua Terra began. Harken's initial deployment struck all across the planet. After a series of ferocious bombardments, war bands of Chaos Marines spearheaded by those with the Sigil of Chorkan descended to the planet. Emperor's Children assault claws attacked industrial plants at Greffendeep. The Runic Blazon warband assaulted the PDF garrison at Tathark Barracks under Sorcerous Darkness. Those with that sigil smashed their way through the defenders, achieving their targets with the weight of Worldclaimer's expectation upon them, but also suffered the most brutal of counterattacks. Scaravectus of the Death Guard carried contagion deep into Urbanaspral Pyroxis, but when his surrounding cult succumbed to their own diseases, his advance was slowed, becoming bogged down in a well-coordinated Imperial defence in the deep hives. The Black Legionnaires of the Crimson Claw, bearing that mark, wreaked havoc on Ascalian Summit, but were then eventually pinned down by a force of Ultramarines and Tempestus Scions. And the Imperial Defence Network, organised by Erudita, proved flexible enough to react pretty well. The Wolf Spear reacted to the invasion of Factorum Conzite 4, hunting Dark Magi through the industrial plants. Forces of Cadians repeatedly deployed from Urbanospral Alpha to other Urbanosprals to reinforce the defenders. The initial Chaos assaults had gone well, despite stiff resistance against the sigil-marked champions, and then the Imperial force had counterattacked pretty quickly. But as the invading forces continued to pour down to the planet, the defenders started to become stretched. Reinforcing columns were bogged down as they crossed the mutated terrain, harried by swarms of Chorkan's demon followers, and Urbanospral Alpha was forced to commit more and more of its own garrison across the planet. Eventually, with Alpha slowly being drained of soldiers and the speed of Imperial reaction slowing down, Haarken struck the capital. Urbanospral Alpha came under attack from 3 separate forces at once. Haarken's own Gloom Talons assaulted the spaceport before moving on to the Prefectus Bastion. The bastion was currently unbreached and was the centre of Erudita's command, housing within it the Cathedral of the Pyre Deified. It was protected by Canoness Viridine and the 55th Preceptory of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, with Legio Defensor Titans stationed outside the main city complex. Worldclaimer's assault was swift, with complete aerial superiority granted to him by the massive flight decks of the Planet Killer. His initial gunship strikes were barely opposed. Veteran Astartes deployed across the port as flares of teleportation light deposited traitor Terminator squads into the control centres. The spaceport fell quickly, with little time for the Imperial defenders to react before Haarken's heavier dropships began landing, using that port as their staging post. On the other side of the Primus district, one of Worldclaimer's trusted commanders, Seran Nethtar, the Chain Flayer, led his Fear Raker warband against the guns of the Tower of Murmuration. The Fear Rakers had been at the vanguard of the Chaos Fleet's advance down the Gauntlet, plundering Imperial cities and destroying orbital stations, and taking vast quantities of weapons and armaments to feed the forces of the Warmaster. They deployed against a dogged defence set up by the Astra Militarum, overseen and commanded by the elite of the Inquisition's forces in the area, the Black Iconoclasts, whose master was at work in the tower itself. The Tower of Murmuration was the astropathic hub of the command complex, and it was under the control of Inquisitor Carter Volnus, who had arrived well ahead of the invasion fleet on a swift ship from Vigilus. Carter Volnus had, somewhat controversially, decided there was no hope left in opposing Abaddon's annexation of the Gauntlet or in holding on to the lost worlds within it. It was his recommendation that the gauntlet be abandoned and then enough forces deployed to the Sanctus Wall to seal the mouth forever, and it was that message that he was attempting to send when disaster struck. One of the more esoteric weapons at Nethtar's disposal were the Dread missiles, vile creations built by his bonded Night Lord's warpsmiths. Each missile was a product of Dark Age technology mixed with ancient Xenos lore, their central coils formed from the shrieking brain stems of captured psychers kept in a state of permanent agony, threaded through with a mixture of engineered hormones and viral scrap code. The only examples were housed within Nethtar's cruiser, the Hollow, and as the assault began, he deployed just one against the tower. The missile detonated above the Tower of Murmuration, a shadow of darkness spreading outwards from the impact site as Nethtar's raptors closed in behind it. As well as the physical darkness, a wave of soul-draining terror spread outwards across the trenches. Soldiers of the Astra Militarum fell, jaws slack and eyes glassy as their brains shut down from psychic overload. Concentrated terror fell in droplets from the skies as the line collapsed, and suddenly Nethtar and the Fear Rakers were through, forcing a breach and slaughtering the black iconoclasts who were attempting to hold the line. The defences simply collapsed, and when the bow wave of psychic distress hit the astropathic chamber at the pinnacle of the tower, the psychic feedback caused it to explode, killing the astropaths and badly wounding Cartavolnus. Facing an unrecoverable situation, Cartavolnus pulled back his remaining iconoclasts and started a fighting retreat towards the Prefectus bastion at the centre of the city. And thirdly, Baron Commodar of House Mandracore led his Chaos Knights against the Emperor's Voice Grand Battery in the Munitorum district to the northeast. The position was defended by Demi-Company Vol of the Guardians of the Covenant chapter, led by the Master of the Guardians' Third Company, Arven Nardeth. The Knights of Daravar had initially hoped to trap the Space Marines, landing in the eastern Hab district and then attacking at speed, while the Demons of Chor Khan attacked from the other direction, but Master Nardeth split his forces, and the advance of the Knights came under attack by swift Outrider squadrons, who sped in circles around the slower walkers. Interrogator Chaplain Sauron led the bikers in swift counterattacks and encircling assaults as Nardeth held the main line with the other half of the Demi-Company, defending the walls of the battery from screaming pink horrors and gouts of warp flame. The Knights were even drawn into the extreme range of the Legio Defensor, and more than one knight was taken down by the firepower of Princeps Drentor's warlord, Thunderlord Lixades, as its accompanying Reavers started to slowly move into position. But even with that reinforcement, the Chaos Attack couldn't totally be halted. Many Brother Marines died to the twisting, mutated energies of Tzeentch, and the skill of House Mandracore's Knight pilots allowed them to avoid the worst of the long-range firepower of Defensor, and before long, several of House Mandracore's heavier chassis managed to smash through the defensive line, followed by a quintet of soul-grinder demon engines who rampaged through the defence laser silos, eventually reaching the main gun batteries and crushing them to mangled wreckage. From that point, Master Nardeth saw no victory to be achieved. With the battery offline, there was no reason to hold the position, and so the Guardians of the Covenant pulled back, voxing their intent to Junith Eruita's command staff. There were other battles to be fought, if not in Urbano Sprawl Alpha, then elsewhere on Sangua Terra. Through all this, Eruita had been coordinating the defences as best she could, battling multiple streams of data in the Bastion Strategium while trying to retain serenity and focus. But as all three forces finally closed in on the Prefectus Bastion, she left the Strategium to lead the defence in person. Harken's Gloomtalons had reached the Bastion first, his initial assault repulsed by the Sisters of the 55th Preceptory, but the fighting had been hard. The Order of our Martyred Lady engaged in a frenzied defence, teams of sisters storming through the Bastion corridors, pushing back the Black Legion invaders with sheets of holy promethium. The only pocket of calm was around Eruita's battle pulpit as she directed her forces efficiently from the front. But though the fighting carried on, the spreading terror cloud from Viridian sector eventually reached the Bastion, mixing with the clouds of black flames emanating from the sisters' positions. The night closed in as the two dark clouds met, But in the middle, there was a twinkle of golden light, which slowly grew and grew. In an explosion of golden radiance, the clouds parted as Saint Celestine appeared again, surrounded by flights of Zephyrim and Seraphim, cherubs and doves and gold and fluttery banners and stuff, apparently tasked by the God Emperor to hold this end of the gauntlet now too. There began a swirling battle in the skies above the cathedral as Celestine's Seraphim tore into Worldclaimer and Nethtar's Raptors, which forced back the attackers somewhat, but Worldclaimer was unworried. The conquest of the spaceport had left him ample time for his heavy armour to deploy, and even as the Raptors and Warp Talons were driven back, armoured columns were converging on the bastion, Black Legion ones from the spaceport in the north, and Night Lords ones from the tower in the southwest. Crucially, Worldclaimer's capture of the spaceport meant he would remain in control of his forces. There were more Black Legion landing than anything else, and his enemy, Eroita, was currently pinned down in the bastion. She'd been slowly reinforcing her Battle Sisters lines and committing her reserves to bolster the defence of the Strategium, but she was unwilling to retreat outside the bastion for fear of being outflanked by those two groups of heavy armour. The Sisters would be forced to hold out, unmoving, until weight of numbers inevitably began to tell on them. But Saint Celestine had quickly realised the same thing. As her Seraphim duelled in the skies, she quit the battlefield for a moment to find Junith Eroita. It was time to accept that Urbano Sprawl Alpha was lost, but there was a whole world still to fight for. If the famously stubborn Eroita would agree to fall back, Celestine and her jump troops would cover their retreat. Faced with the inevitable, Eroita started retasking her forces yet again. She planned a ruse, leading a false breakout northwest before the majority of her forces moved southeast into the twisted Flare Scar, identified as the fastest place for dropships to retrieve her forces. As the ruse lured Harken's Raptors in, Celestine and her vanguard counterattacked, pushing the Chaos jump troops north into the ruins of the Primus district as Eroita's breakout wheeled round to the south. Further south still, Master Nardreth of the Guardians of the Covenant had fought a running battle in the ruins, eventually forcing the Knights of House Mandracore to overextend, allowing him to kill quite a lot of their fastest walkers. When he heard Eroita's extraction order, he called in his own gunships for extraction, and leaving the bastion at the same time with a small bodyguard, Inquisitor Carter Volnus did the same. The Titans of Legio Defensor were to be less lucky, unable to quickly exit Urbana Sprawl Alpha, now overrun by the forces of Chaos, and with their own god machines swamped in hordes of demons. Princeps Drentor unleashed everything into the twisting mass and then gave the order for his maniple to detonate their cores. Junith Eroita and the Order of our Martyred Lady raced to their extraction point at the Flare Scar, chased by the armoured companies of the Black Legion. Wheeling round from her battle against the Raptors to the north, the Living Saints swept down on that armoured column, slowing them enough for the Sisters of the Order to make good their escape, and then fighting as the rearguard. The last Imperial ships to leave Urbana Sprawl Alpha were carrying Junith Eroita and Saint Celestine. Now in control of the bastion, Haarken Worldclaimer's warpsmiths brought the Strategium systems back online. Around him were his assembled champions, but missing were all the ones who had been marked with the demon's sigil. They had been the price paid for the demon's support. Those commanders most likely to disobey him had completed their objectives, but suffered the most heavy losses, their souls forfeit to Chor Khan. Worldclaimer assigned new targets to his remaining reliable champions, targets that ranged across the whole of Sangua Terra, and as he did so, the Dark Magi of Omega Threx wheeled in a strange casket, plugging it directly into the Strategium systems. Inside, the tortured and twisted remains of a certain naval admiral would provide Haarken access codes to Imperial data for the entire planet. And that's where we leave it this time. Sangua Terra is under concerted assault from Worldclaimer's forces, who used diversion tactics to not only rid themselves of their less reliable commanders, but also pull forces away from the capital. And once it was weakened, they took Urbana Sprawl Alpha in the face of stiff opposition by the Adeptus Sororitas. The Imperium have redeployed in the hope of continuing the war elsewhere on the planet, but Haarken seems to have the upper hand for now, and he hasn't even used that massive gun on the front of the Planet Killer yet. There! After 5 videos, we are up to date with the Nachmund Gauntlet, though it seems from this story pretty clear that there's going to be a 6th at some point in the future as the war on Sangua Terra continues. Until then, Warzone Nachmund continues to rage as the great big scrying lens of 40k moves across the galaxy to even more war zones that we still haven't covered yet. I guess it's time to start researching catch-up videos for the next big war zone. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see more videos about 40k or just support the channel in general, you can like and subscribe, you can look at our second channel or buy merch from the merch store, or join the Patreon and YouTube membership schemes. Links for all of that are in the thing below. See ya!